but then the mic comes on and I'm yelling, and then... All right, now we on? All right, great. Good morning, everyone. Are you guys ready to study about Samson? You've been working out? Yeah. In the spirit of the class and kind of what Jeff had sent me a message about, the last few weeks and what we've been doing, the thought of these, these are not just children's stories. And of all the characters, Samson, a strong argument can be made it should never be a children's story because of some of the topics that are covered, right? On its surface, it makes a great hero story for kids, but once you get a little deeper, if you were to make a list of things that I don't necessarily want to talk about with my 4-year-old or 5-year-old, Samson covers 15 of those things. And so it's probably one of the more rehabilitated he's probably one of the more rehabilitated characters because there's some really hard topics in it, right? But a lot of the beauty of the story is in his faults. And so our goal today will be to kind of, go over some of those faults, maybe get some details out of it that we haven't seen in the past, and then see how his actions correspond with God's plan. So I want a little bit of participation. Give me a few words that you guys associate with Samson, hopefully positive and negative. Strength. It's a good one. Kind of low-hanging fruit, but it's a good one. Big, okay. Delilah, all right. So definitely some important characters. What else? What was that? Spoiled, okay. Long hair, all right. So, Nazarite maybe. Okay. Womanizing, that's a good one. Chosen, right? He's a deliverer. He's also pretty egotistical, right? Vengeful. It's a pretty big discrepancy between the good and the bad, which probably applies to a lot of us in a lot of different ways. But Samson's highs are probably better than anyone in this room, and his lows are hopefully worse than anyone in this room. So we're going to start initially in Judges 13, right? So we find ourselves at the back part of Judges. We see in Judges this cycle, right? So Israel falls, and then God tries to bring them back. But every time in each one of these cycles, we see a level of societal decay, right? So they never quite get back to where they were. There's this steady downward trend. In Judges 17, even though that's a little after the Samson story, but it describes it pretty well. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Every man did which was right in his own eyes. And so that's kind of where we find Samson kind of acting on his own, doing what is, in his opinion, the right thing. So we're going to start in verse 1, Judges 13. Israel has done evil, and they have been handed over to the Philistines for 40 years. And so that's our setting. Our setting is we're 40 years into oppression by the Philistines. And besides that being a problem, an even bigger problem is, for the most part, the Israelites, they really don't care, right? They're content in their oppression. So verse 2, a certain man of Zorah named Manoah from the clan of the Danites had a wife who was childless, unable to give birth. The angel of the Lord appeared to her and said, "You are barren and childless, but you are going to become pregnant and give birth to a son. Now see to it that you drink no wine or other fermented drink, and that you do not eat anything unclean. You will become pregnant and have a son whose head is never to be touched by a razor, because the boy is to be a Nazarite, dedicated to God from the womb. He will take the lead in delivering Israel from the hands of the Philistines." So stopping right there, we're seeing right at the beginning, Samson's in a unique place, right? He's a unique person in that an angel of the Lord predicts his birth. There's not a ton of those people throughout the Bible, right? Old Testament, you can see some predictions like Isaac and Ishmael and Samson. In the New Testament, John the Baptist, Jesus. But this automatically puts him in a very select group. Looking at verse 4, a couple interesting things in that is, one, God selects him and sees his value in the womb. Now, culturally for us, that's a pretty big discussion about when life begins and value and things like that. And at least for Samson, we see his importance to God is prior to birth. Medically, something that I find super interesting is the warning against alcohol and pregnancy, and I was actually looking into that. This is the first example in literature of a warning about drinking when pregnant. Again, I have a bias to that, and I don't think that's necessarily what God's saying here, warning about fetal alcohol exposure or anything like that. It's definitely more related to the Nazirite vow, but it's still interesting. Now, we see in verse 5 the prediction that he's going to begin to deliver the Israelites from the Philistines. And in that, there's a little bit of foreshadowing, right? Because it says he probably doesn't complete it. And some of that speaks to the issues that he's going to have in the future. Now, logical question would be, what's a Nazirite, right? If we go back to number 6, we see a few pretty good verses about what a Nazirite is, and we're going to kind of summarize that. But there's also some things that don't apply to him. So in number 6, we see that the Nazirite vow is usually a voluntary vow. So these are people that have decided to set themselves apart to accomplish a goal or something like that. And that doesn't apply to Samson. It was decided for him. In number 6, we see usually has a start and an end period. Well, Samson's is birth to death. So that makes him a little unique in that as well. A lot of us are more familiar with the three major things that the Nazirites try to avoid, right? So they have to be careful with avoiding fermented drink, grapes, even the skins of it, that kind of thing, right? So should have no association with that. They should have no association with dead bodies, right? Even if someone were to die near to them, that becomes a problem. And as we all know with Samson, he's not very good at that, right? And then we kind of talked about with some of the words, cutting of the hair. There's a very important symbolism in part of the Nazirite vow where you were to let your hair grow. And cutting it, at least in number 6, signifies an end to the vow. And so as we kind of move forward through the story, those are some important things to think about. So we come back to verse 6. Again, his mom, and we don't know her name, so I'm just going to refer to her as his mother, goes to her husband and says, "Hey, the angel of the Lord's come to me. This is what he says." And so verse 8, we see Manoah prayed to the Lord, "Pardon your servant, Lord. I beg you to let the man of God you sent to us come again and teach us how to bring up the boy who is to be born." So the angel returns, and he kind of goes through detailing again what he had told his wife. And Manoah responds, "Well, I'm gonna cook you dinner." And the angel says, "Well, I'm not going to eat with you, but if you make an offering to the Lord." So Manoah took a young goat together with the grain offering and sacrificed it on a rock to the Lord. And the Lord did an amazing thing while Manoah and his wife watched. As the flame blazed up from the altar toward heaven, the angel of the Lord ascended in the flame. Seeing this, Manoah and his wife fell with their faces to the ground. When the angel of the Lord did not show himself again, Manoah and his wife realized that it was an angel of the Lord. I really like verse 22. He responds, "We are doomed to die." He said it to his wife. He said, "We have seen God." But his wife answered, "If the Lord had meant to kill us, he would have not accepted a burnt offering and a grain offering from our hands, nor shown us all the things, or now told us this." The woman gave birth to a boy and named him Samson. He grew, and the Lord blessed him. And the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him. So the reason we're kind of focusing on this, right, this is prior to Samson, and the reason we're kind of discussing this is our one kind of look into how Samson was raised with his parents. If you look, their responses seem to point to at least some level of faith. There's not much skepticism, so when the angel comes to the mom, she accepts it. She goes and talks to her husband about it, and there's no skepticism there either, right? It's like he immediately prays and asks for help in raising the boy. And so it gives us a kind of an interesting look at them, right? We see other people that are told amazing things, and sometimes they respond in disbelief or they question. And from the parent standpoint, what we have is they accept it. Now, the reason I really like verse 22 is because Manoah gets a response to his prayer, and his response to God answering his prayer is, "I am doomed to die." For us, it's kind of a good example of you got to be careful what you pray for, right? Because sometimes it's overwhelming. And then it also gives a really good insight, again, in that maybe Samson's mom's the more logical one, right? He's just certain that the end is near, and she's like, "Well, This doesn't make any sense. So he kind of brings him off the ledge. But in the global picture, the important thing to kind of realize here is what we see of Samson's parents and the upbringing that hopefully this kind of inferred is that Samson got a decent upbringing. A lot of his issues that we see later on aren't necessarily a product of what his parents did or did not do. So we're going to go next now to chapter 14. Okay, and so this is where things start to get interesting, right? We kind of see a dichotomy develop where on the surface, you see a series of progressively worsening mistakes from Samson. And in the global picture, you see this being the dominoes that start to fall that allow the Israelites to come into conflict with the Philistines. So verse 14, Samson went down to Timnah and saw there a young Philistine woman. When he returned, he said to his father and mother, I have seen a Philistine woman in Timnah. Now get her for me as a wife. Again, his parents, right, we said they seem to have some type of pretty strong moral background, replied, Isn't there an acceptable woman among your relatives or among all our people? Must you go to the uncircumcised Philistines to get a wife? But Samson said to his father, Get her for me. She's the right one for me. His parents did not know that this was from the Lord, who was seeking an occasion to confront the Philistines, for at that time they were ruling over Israel. And some of the translations even say, she is right for me in my eyes. So in a way, he's looking, he's seeing, he's desiring. Verse 5, Samson went down to Timnah together with his father and mother, and they approached the vineyard of Timnah. Suddenly a young lion came roaring towards him. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him so that he tore the lion apart with his bare hands, as he might have torn a young goat. But he told neither his father nor his mother what he had done. So this is our first episode of seeing Samson's strength. And he intentionally keeps this quiet from his parents. The natural question that would be why, right? Samson's not somebody that usually would stray away from giving himself praise. There's a possibility, maybe he didn't quite understand what had happened. Maybe related to the Nazirite vow, there was some concern from his standpoint that, I've dealt with something that was unclean. Maybe I shouldn't mention it to my parents. Verse 7, then he went down and talked with the woman and liked her. Sometime later, when he went back to marry her, he turned aside to look at the lion's carcass, and in it saw a swarm of bees and some honey. He scooped out the honey with his hands and ate it as he went along. When he rejoined his parents, he gave them some, and they too ate. But he did not tell them that he had taken the honey from the lion's carcass. So, there's some points that are definitely not irrelevant, descriptions. Some of the commentators say, first and foremost, bees usually do not inhabit in cadavers. I'm not an expert on bees, but I'll take it for what it's worth. But it creates an interesting possibility that this event was, something brought on by God, at least something that you don't typically see in nature. Second, like many other circumstances in life, we see an example of a physical test followed by a spiritual test. He does great with the physical test, right? The Spirit of the Lord comes on him, he kills the lion, but then he has the opportunity to continue to follow and complete his Nazirite vow. But he clearly doesn't, right? Because he returns to the corpse of the lion, which would, just from a standard Israelite standpoint, would be unclean to use any honey or anything from that. Second, it would even be more so unclean as a Nazirite. And third, giving this to his parents would also make them unclean. So, his parents have spent at least a decent part of their lives making sure that he's sanctified, that he's set apart, raising him in the right way. And then he gets an opportunity and he kind of desecrates them, right? So it's an interesting way that we kind of see this, from a kid's standpoint, it'd be like, oh, Samson attacks a lion. Samson kills a lion. Well, that's pretty cool. But from a deeper standpoint, there's a lot that goes on here that we don't necessarily recognize. So back to the story, right? So he's kind of going about, he found someone that he loves. He's going to marry her. It's time for us to have a party. And so Samson responds with, let's make a bet, right? I've got a riddle. Verse 14, out of the eater something to eat, out of the strong something sweet. And the deal was, right, is he gives them 7 days, and if they can figure it out, he's going to reward them with 30 pieces of clothing. If they can't figure it out, they owe him, right? So for 3 days, they could not answer. On the 4th day, they said to Samson's wife, "Coax your husband into explaining the riddle for us, or we will burn you and your father's household to death. Did you invite us here to steal our property?" Samson's wife threw herself on him, sobbing, "You hate me. You don't really love me. You've given me a riddle, but you haven't told me the answer." She cried for the whole 7 days of the feast. So in the 7th day, he finally told her, because she continued to press him. She in turn explained the riddle to her people. Before sunset on the 7th day, the men of the towns said to him, "What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion?" Samson said to them, "If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle." And so the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. He went down to Ashkelon, struck down 30 of their men, stripped them of everything they gave, and gave their clothes to those who had explained the riddle. Burning with anger, he returned to his father's house. And Samson's wife was given to one of the companions who attended him at the feast. So here's one of the first big dominoes to fall, right? As we kind of talked earlier, the goal of God was to create a rift, a conflict between the Philistines and the Israelites. The Israelites really don't have any interest in it. So he uses Samson, right? It also portrays Samson as a complex character because it shows his extraordinary strength, but he's incredibly impulsive, he's emotional, he has no problem killing 30 men, right? We start to see how his questionable decisions start to drive him down while also fulfilling God's purpose. So next we come to chapter 15. One of the important things here to mention is it says at the time of the wheat harvest, right? So when we start kind of thinking about the global picture of the relationship between the Israelites and the Philistines, this is harvest time, okay? And Samson returns to get his wife. But clearly there's a major misunderstanding because her father apparently assumed, well, he's not coming back, and gave her to someone else. And so he shows up at the door. He says, "I want to see my wife." And her dad's like, "Listen, that's gone. I'm sorry. But have you seen my daughter?" He tries to rectify the situation, right? And says, "She's actually prettier than my other daughter. So this is a good deal for you." But that enrages Samson, right? So how does he respond? He takes 300 foxes, ties their tails together, sets it on fire, and sets them through the fields. And like we said, when was this? This is during the wheat harvest, right? So on its surface, from a story, this is a fantastic story. I mean, what a great imagery, right? But from a large-scale perspective, if you're thinking about this from God's standpoint, this is equivalent to guerrilla warfare, right? This is a national attack. This is an attack on their food. This is an attack on their trade. And so, we see a differing in Samson shows no understanding that he's kind of viewing it as that. But on the global picture, we see that this is God basically helping instigate and start a war between the two people. The Philistine response to this is pretty interesting too, right? So, when they ask who did this, they find out it's Samson, and they're like, well, what's the story? Why would he do this? And they kind of hear the story about his wife's father giving who he thought was his wife away. What is their response? Who do they seem to blame? Well, they killed the father and his wife, right? And so it's an interesting thing because that wouldn't typically be how you would respond, necessarily kill some of your own people. So either one, culturally, they kind of agree with Samson, or in a bigger standpoint, maybe they're cowards and they're like, listen, we can't take Samson. So we've got to find somebody to blame. We're going to blame them. The irony here, of course, is for Samson's wife is the reason this whole thing happened in the beginning was because she was trying to avoid having herself and her family and her house and stuff like that set on fire, and actually her actions lead to that, right? So from her standpoint, it's she kind of ended up causing her own doom. In chapter 15, verse 7, we see The Philistines, however, greatly underestimated Samson. They underestimated possibly his commitment to his wife, for sure his preparedness to retaliate, and his physical strength. And his justification for his actions are pretty classic. He says, "Since you acted like this, I will get revenge on you. And afterwards, I'm going to quit." So if you're thinking of Samson as this person that's like called to separate the people of God from the Philistines and to lead them, is he going to say, after this, I'm going to quit? Of course not, right? So he seems to continue to be acting on his own vengefulness with no understanding of his greater calling, at least no intent to act on it. And so in 15 verse 8, we see his response where he viciously attacks and overwhelms the Philistines that he holds responsible. And then likely realizing that this is going to lead to retaliation, what does he do? He flees to Judah. And so the Philistines then bring an army to Judah looking for him. And so we should pause here for a second, because if you're in Judah, and if you're looking for a way to rebel against your oppressors, you've got a man in your midst with immense strength who's killed a huge number of your enemy, set their fields on fire, jeopardized their economy. This is a really good opportunity for you to raise an army and fight back. And they do raise an army, right? But what did they raise an army for? To capture Samson. So in verses 11 through 13, we see that Samson's escalation in this, in a sudden small, setting the fields on fire is not small, but in relatively, these small dominoes are leading to an international crisis, which is exactly what God wants and exactly what he brought Samson to do, but the Israelites aren't having any of it. So the conversation between the men of Judah and the delegation that they raised is pretty interesting, because what did they say? They say, "Don't you realize that the Philistines are rulers over us?" There's not even any thought of rebellion. They're like, "What are you doing, Samson? Why are you putting us in this situation?" There's no desire to be a part of God's calling. So Samson makes a deal with him. He's like, "Hey, okay, you can capture me, just don't kill me." And so we pick up in verse 14. As he approaches Lehi, the Philistines came towards him shouting. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon him in power. The ropes on his arms become like charred flax, and the bindings dropped from his hands. Finding a fresh jawbone of a donkey, he grabbed it and struck down 1,000 men. Verse 16, then Samson said, "With a donkey's jawbone, I have made donkeys of them. With a donkey's jawbone, I have killed 1,000 men." When he finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone, and the place was called Ramath Lehi. Because he was very thirsty, he cried out to the Lord, "You have given your servant this great victory. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" Then God opened up the hollow place in Lehi, and water came out of it. When Samson drank, his strength returned, and he revived. So the spring was called En Hakkore, and it is still there in Lehi. What's interesting here, right, is we kind of see a difference in interpretation between what the narrator describes things and how Samson describes things. The narrator's comments are, "The Spirit of the Lord came upon him in power." The ropes physically change. They become like charred flax, and they drop off, right? So that's a kind of a miraculous event almost. The narrator's describing God's actions. But what's Samson saying? Samson's saying, "With a donkey of a jawbone, I have made donkeys of them. I have killed 1,000 men." It's not until we see his first sign of weakness with his extreme thirst that he even brings God into the picture. And finally, he mentions it, but it's not out of thankfulness, right? It's stimulated by his own, weakness. And then he's fearing being captured by the remaining Philistines. And so if you think about this, we're kind of, when you're kids and you set up dominoes, and we've all seen the videos, you get the tiny domino, and then it gets bigger, bigger, and bigger. Well, as we're kind of going forward through this story, it's hard to kind of tell where you're going, because there's just these series of fantastical events, and it's really easy to miss the forest for the trees. because these trees, they're great, right? I mean, these are awesome stories. I mean, the foxes, like just thinking about running through the fields and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it would have been something to see. But it's easy to miss the big picture, and it's not until we stand at the back end and kind of work our way back that we can kind of see what's going on. So if we start at the back end and we see, okay, Samson was revived by the waters of Lehi because God opened up the hollow. Why? Well, God opened it up because he cried out. Why did he cry out? Because he exhausted himself slaying thousands of Philistines. Why did he do that? Well, they'd come to capture him. Why did they come to capture him? Well, he'd been handed over by Judah, right? They handed him over because he sought refuge, because he had attacked those who had killed his wife. Philistines burned Samson's wife and father-in-law because he had burned their crops. He burned their crops because his father-in-law had given him to someone else. Samson's father-in-law had given his wife to someone else because Samson had not returned because he was angry. Samson had been angry and killed 30 men because he had lost his riddle bet. And the Philistines had solved the riddle because they had threatened his wife. Why did the riddle even develop? Well, Samson had broken his Nazirite vow and gotten honey from a carcass. Why was he even on that road? Well, he was going to meet his wife. Why did he even meet that woman? Because God was seeking an occasion to confront the Philistines. So you see this kind of ascending domino pattern that is all started, a small spark set from God sets the whole fire, right? And these events are not random. They're perfectly planned to meet God's will. So, as we've kind of summarized those two chapters, we see God, for the most part, is absent from these events. But his agenda is being achieved masterfully in every event of Samson's life. At the same time, while the agenda is being achieved, Samson's life's all downhill. So it brings us finally to chapter 16, right? So the last chapter of the Samson story, and probably the one we're the most familiar with. It's kind of broken up into two separate sections, and so we got like kind of the first 3 verses, and then, as we kind of mentioned, the story of Delilah. The first 3 verses, pretty interesting, right? 1, we see Samson with a prostitute, not ideal. But we also see that there's a major change in the way the Philistines are acting towards him. So the whole town finds out that he's there, and what do? They all lay in wait, and the plan is to kill him in the morning. We see Samson awake at midnight and arise, and instead of just simply escaping, he literally picks up the gate and carries it to a hill that's in front of Hebron. Now, what the commentators say on this is thought to be about 30 to 40 miles that he carries this gate. And historically, these gates are pretty large. For me, carrying Chase's car seat from here to the car is pretty hard. And so it speaks to his unbelievable... This is an absurd amount of strength, right? This is not a really strong man. This is a God-given strength that is beyond anything within reason. And so we kind of carry that into verse 4. And so finally, we have Delilah on the scene. And it says a couple things. We see 1, he loved her. And 2, she's immediately trying to betray him. Now, the amount of money offered also is absurd. There's actually discussions about, is it even accurate, because it would be such an insanely large amount. So the point is Delilah is being paid really, really well for this. And so Delilah says to Samson in verse 6, "Tell me the secret of your great strength and how you can be tied up and subdued." Samson answered her, "If anyone ties me with 7 fresh thongs that have not been dried, I'll become as weak as any other man." And she tied him with them. And she yelled, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." But he snaps the thongs as easily as a piece of string snaps. I had to look this up. Does anyone know what a thong is, besides like in the shoe or other things? It's like a fresh piece of gut. And so ironically, when he specifically says they have not been dried, he's intentionally, I don't know about intentionally if he's even thinking about it, but he's asking to be tied and come into contact with something unclean. So this is animal gut. So he has a way to lie in any way that he wants, but he chooses a way, consciously or unconsciously, to break his Nazirite vow. And so it's consistent for Samson, right? Verse 10, then Delilah said to Samson, "You have made a fool of me. You lied to me. Come now, tell me how you can be tied." He said, "If anyone ties me securely with new ropes that have never been used, I'll become as weak as any other man." How does it work out? Does it work out? No. Verse 13, she asks again, "If you weave the 7 braids of my head into fabric on the loom and tighten it with a pin, then I'll become as weak as any other man." So while he was sleeping, Delilah took the 7 braids of his head, wove them into fabric, and tightened it with a pin. And she called to him, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He woke from his sleep and pulled up the pin. No big deal, right? So now she's had enough. Verse 15, "How can you say I love you when you won't confide in me? This is the 3rd time you have made a fool of me and haven't told me the secret of your great strength." With such nagging, she prodded him day after day until he was tired to death. So he told her everything. "No razor has ever been used on my head, because I have been a Nazirite set apart to God since birth. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man." When Delilah saw that he had told her everything, she sent word to the rulers of the Philistines, "Come back once more. He has told me everything." So the rulers of the Philistines returned with the silver in their hands. Having put him to sleep on her lap, she called a man to shave off the 7 braids of his hair, and so began to subdue him, and his strength left him. Then he called, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." A few interesting points. How many remembered that she didn't actually shave his head? She called someone else. I don't know. In my head, I'd always thought that it was she that did it, but turns out she had someone else do it. Okay. It's interesting too. She adopts the blackmailing tactic that his wife did, right? Kind of does the same thing, saying, "We have no intimacy. How can you say you love me if you don't tell me everything?" So Samson clearly learned nothing from the previous events, right? We do have some confirmation too that he does at least understand in some sense that his strength comes from God, and it's related to his Nazirite vow. He's broken his Nazirite vow so many times that you're kind of like, well, maybe he doesn't really get it. But at this point, he seems to he understands it's somewhat related. But other parts of the story, for me, personally, are really hard to get, because you're just sitting here and you're like, how can someone be this dumb, right? But how do you not read through the story and say, this doesn't, how many times does this happen where he doesn't wake up and he doesn't realize? And so it raises some serious questions, right? Is it because he's had no accountability thus far? I mean, every single mistake he's made, he's in a way gotten through it with, if anything, personal glory. So maybe he's got no accountability. Maybe he doesn't really believe this will ever become an issue. Maybe he misunderstands how much of his strength's from God. Maybe he's kind of fooled himself into thinking that, yeah, God's helping me, but most of this is me, and so I can still get out of it, even if I break the vow. Maybe this is part of the miraculous nature of it. You have to be pretty tired to sleep through someone putting your hair in a loom and things like that. Maybe this is a part of a God thing that we don't quite understand. At the same time, when we kind of look back on our own lives and we think about some of the things we've done, how often do you kind of look back and you're like, man, how dumb was I, right? So maybe this is more a description of just the human condition, in that it's not until we look back later and realize what it's cost us.
I see it's a powerful woman.
Yeah, that's fair. Right. Sure. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. If he shows up in clinic, he's getting like a list of diagnoses. He's that long. You know what I'm saying? Like it's a pathology at this point for sure. Right. Oh, right. No, he's yeah. I mean, it's a fascinating look at a person that gives, all of us in some ways hope, because there's not many times most of us will be in a situation that we repeatedly, I don't know, maybe we would definitely mess up enough. But point is if Samson can make a turnaround, the rest of us can too, right? All right. So well, that's kind of part of the point is, like, some of this story is just very hard. Like, is it a God thing? Is God, his ultimate will being done? And so in some ways he made Samson really sleepy. I don't know, but it's hard to understand, right? Yeah. Everyone can be sleepy. This is, everyone can be tired. Yeah, exactly. All right. So coming into verse 20, he awoke from his sleep and thought, I'll go out as before and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had left him. And so that answers some of our question with his powers, right? Is that he clearly couldn't always tell what was him and what was God. And so he doesn't have a full understanding that God's left him. So then the Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, and took him down to Gaza. Binding him with bronze shackles, they set him to grinding in the prison. But the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. And so, ultimately, the ironies of the sudden shift of power to just absolutely nothing overnight for him are pretty interesting, right? He's somebody that was basically governed by his sight. He saw it, he liked it, he did it, he took it, he came and went as he pleased. He loses his sight, right? All his freedom is suddenly gone. He had spent his life kind of insulting, humiliating his enemies. Now he's left to grind flour in prison. And so he's gone from like the chosen deliverer of God to in the lowest position imaginable in an unbelievably short amount of time. But the narrator helps us a little bit, right? He gives us a little hope. In verse 22, he throws in that little hook. But his hair began to grow again. And so in a way, it's some cool literary foreshadowing that says, hey, something's coming. Don't lose all hope. Now, verse 23. The rulers of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to celebrate, saying, our God has delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hands. While they were in high spirits, they shouted, bring out Samson to entertain us. So they called Samson out of prison, and he performed for them. And when they stood him among the pillars, Samson said to the servant who held his hand, put me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple, so that I may lean against them. Now the temple was crowded with men and women. All the rulers of the Philistines were there, and on the roof were about 3,000 men and women watching Samson perform. So Samson is so thoroughly humbled, he's having to ask someone to show him where pillars are, right? I mean, he's completely helpless. I mean, he's lost everything that he has. But this whole situation that he's in and that he finds himself in, the point of redemption that's coming, right? Would any of this be possible if things had gone differently earlier on? If Samson had learned from his mistake with his first wife, he wouldn't have fallen for Delilah, right? If Samson wasn't so thoroughly weak and humiliated, the Philistines know about I'm sure all the Philistines within hundreds of miles know everything about him in the surrounding areas, right? He killed 1,000 people with a jawbone. There's zero scenarios where if I'm a Philistine and I hear about this kind of thing, I'm going to go and get close enough to this guy to look if there's any threat, right? So the whole scenario is only made possible because Samson has lost so much. And from a more spiritual standpoint and being able to turn around what he's done and kind of, be reconciled, if he's not thoroughly so humbled, is he going to ever learn from his mistakes? And even then you could ask if he ever did, right? But so verse 28 says, Samson prayed to the Lord, O sovereign Lord, remember me, O God. Please strengthen me just once more. And let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. Then Samson reached toward the 2 central pillars on which the temple stood. Bracing himself against them, his right hand on one and his left hand on the other, Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. Then he pushed with all his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and all the people in it. Thus he killed many more when he died than when he lived. So a few points on this that's, again, super interesting to me is if Samson's in any other state, none of these people are here. None of God's desire to basically, from a global standpoint, from a political standpoint, all the Philistine rulers are there. All thousands of Philistine citizens are there. God's ultimate goal is to create a rift and to start the deliverance of the people from that. None of this is possible in the early parts without Samson going through these actions with basically no accountability, and then none of it's possible at the back end without Samson being so thoroughly humbled. The other thing that's interesting, though, is Samson still kind of shows who he is because he still doesn't at least publicly recognize his calling. Why does he say that he wants to tear down the temple? To revenge his eyes, right? So it's interesting. So it's like, did Samson learn? I mean, we've got some other reasons and like Hebrews and things to think that, he shows faith. But what's actually described to us is Samson's kind of staying along the same path and at least not fully understanding his purpose. But the important thing in all this, right, is that he does return back to God. So, when you look at this overall, if anything positive comes from Samson's life, it's due to the gracious interventions of God, right? His birth had promised so much, and there's no doubt that in many ways it's a disappointment. But ironically, by the free exercise of his, evil proclivity, he serves as a pretty efficient agent for God. And so, ultimately, probably the message for us on this kind of thing is life and death are in the hands of God. But if God is determined to build his people, even if they become, even if we're our own worst enemy, there can be salvation kind of through his grace and through his workings. And so it's probably something, that hopefully we can kind of take into our own lives. You guys have any comments or questions or thoughts? Right. It's a great point. Right. Yeah, without verse 4, none of this matters. It's just, without verse 4, it's just evil. You know? So, yeah, that's the context that gives the rest of it meaning. All right. Well, if no other comments, next week we are going to be learning about David and Goliath. I think that'll be from Joel Zellner. Look forward to that. Thank you.